All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming out. I know late at night, 9 o'clock already. I think this is the latest we've ever had any of our series. But thanks everyone for coming and joining. And Mitzvah Hashem, we'll learn something together. Before I start with anything official as far as Minhagim and what we'll be learning. So what I always think of when I think of Minhagim is something that happened years ago. I was young. I was probably, I don't know, maybe 8, 10. I don't know what I was. And my cousin Moshe was visiting us for Pesach. Now, my cousin Moshe is a Breslover. And when I say Breslover, I mean a Breslover chassid, the type that goes out into the forest and, talks to Abba and screams Abba in the forest. And quite a wonderful, colorful, spiritual human being. Baruch Hashem, I'm still very close to him. Really an amazing person. But he had very interesting customs, and especially as a person who'd never been exposed to anything really Hasidish, so to say. So things that he used to do to me were just a little far out. So I remember one Pesach he came to visit us, and here we are at the Seder, everyone at their plates, nice white tablecloth. We've barely begun, and my father says Kiddush, and my cousin Moshe wants to say Kiddush, and I was sitting right next to him. So he turns to me and he says, Yosef, and he puts out his hands, put the wine in my hands. So I'm thinking, okay. So I grabbed the bottle and poured it right into his hands. And the look on his face, the shock, was unbelievable. And I'm just looking, well, that's what you told me to do. You said, put it in your hands, right? Okay. You meant lift up the Kiddush cup. I'll keep Kabbalah. There's a Kabbalistic reason, put it in your hands. But to this day, the reason why was because, hey, cousin Moshe has weird customs. Who am I to argue? Put the wine in his hands. So when I think of customs, when I think of Minhagim, I think of that Pesach Seder where the wine's splashing everywhere, all over his hands, his Bekasha at the table, because he said, put the wine in my hands. So anyway, that's what I think of when I think of Minhagim. And really, first of all, it's nice family lore, a family thing that we laugh about every single year. But I think it does frame what we're going to be learning together. Because when it comes to customs, there are a lot of, let's say, odd customs out there. And that means family minhagim. That means customs that are communal and obviously individual. So while tonight we're not exactly going to be talking about individual customs exactly, Amir Hashem, that's next week. We'll talk about some fascinating customs that are out there, some that many people keep, some that, are less common. But tonight, I want to focus on how do customs start, right? How does something start? It's like the famous joke about why the brisket has to be cut off on either end. Why? Because the grandmother, her tray or her dish was only so large. So how do customs start, both on an individual, on a familiar level, and on a communal level? How did they begin? How did they become binding? And what if I don't want to keep a custom anymore? What if I don't want to keep a custom I myself took on? And what if I don't want to keep a family custom, right? People get married. And maybe if there's time, in Mitzvah Hashem, maybe we'll discuss also what it means to when people are married, what it means to keep each other's customs and how that evolves. So with that basic introduction, let us begin. So we have a source sheet here. It's been shared on the chat. And again, as I've said before, so if anyone has any questions, anyone has any comments or just thoughts, so please feel free to unmute yourself at any point. I'll try to stop at certain points at the in the shir to open up for questions if people would like. So
Rabbi Postelnek?
Yes.
I'm not able to open up the source material. Can it be sent around, please? Just without, it's because it says I don't have this certain electronic mail list that I'm not signed up to. I didn't get documents before.
Take a look in the chat. I just put in the chat a second time because.
Did it work? Is anyone else?
I just see the chat comment. I don't see any document. But it'll be easier if you sent around, because if I look on the chat, then I can't watch you on the screen. So
I have nothing in the chat either.
Let me see if I can try to share it myself.
You have to download it.
You have to download it and then open it. But also
Open it up,
it was
just
sent
download it.
earlier.
Richard,
Wasn't
can you download?
well, we're not in the middle of the class right now. If we could just send it out, that would be helpful.
Okay, I tried sending it myself. Okay. All right.
It's an Adobe file. You have to download it and then open it up.
Okay. Well, what I'll do is in the meantime, I'll make sure to spell out any sources that we're seeing. Again, while we are text-based, hopefully a lot of it we'll be able to say outside and the like. It was, if anyone has access to the email that was sent today, you can also find the source sheet in the email, even if you are having trouble and difficulty downloading it from the Zoom chat. Okay, so let's see source one. So basically, just as the background, there are different types of minhagim, right? There's communal, there's family minhagim, and then there's individual. And I saw suggested, and I think it does fall out this way, that you can see these three types of minhagim in three different sources. So in source one from Mishlei, the pasuk says, "Shema b'ni musar avicha v'altitos tarasimecha." That listen, my son, to the discipline of your father, to the musar, to what he's telling you, and don't forsake the instructions of your mother. And many take this to actually be a source for minhagim, because there are the things, there's the halachos, there's the laws, there's everything that's passed down by the father or by the family, and we have a tradition for everything. But there's also the tradition of the family, of the mother, of the home, and those are the family minhagim, the family customs that are passed down from one generation to the next. And so we find a source there that telling us not to forsake minhagim, that minhagim actually have something binding to them. There's something very important to them. There's something very beautiful to them. And that's what initially we see from that line. We'll see it later quoted in later Gemaras when it comes to minhagim, when it comes to customs. This is a pasuk, this is a line that is taken and cited. And the second pasuk also from Mishlei, but it also relates to a pasuk in Devarim, that al tasei gvu olam asher asu abosecha, that you can't remove an ancient boundary, an ancient wall or place marker that your fathers set. And of course, it's a pasuk in Devarim that we can't encroach on the boundary of others. And that on a physical level means that if there's boundaries between one's houses or one's property, you can't just go up and, well, I want an extra 2 feet on my property. Besides for zoning issues and zoning laws, it's against halacha. You can't just take your pole and take your fence, move it over 2 feet. The guy wakes up the next morning, where'd 2 feet of my property go? So that's on a physical level. And of course, on a halachic level, it also extends to different businesses coming into town. How can one business encroach on the other? But on a more hashkafic and also used on a halachic level, minhagim, that we can't change or move the boundaries that our fathers, that the previous generation set and put into place. And it might not be that it was originally a binding halacha. It's not a masorah, it's not a tradition that we have going back to Sinai, but there are certain minhagim, there are certain customs that a community or a family creates and puts in place. And we're told, don't encroach upon those, don't move them, don't change them. Rather, you have to follow them. So that
question.
Yes.
Yeah, is it maybe an idea that there's a gvul, like a boundary, like making a fence around the Torah, that maybe some of these minhagim are ways to help keep us from doing real halachas wrong?
Yes, that is an excellent point. And certainly I would add to that, that there are different types of minhagim. There are types of minhagim that we keep to avoid going too far and transgressing anything in the Torah. There are positive minhagim that we do to buttress the mitzvos that we have, to make them more more workable, or sometimes just more meaningful. And then there are other minhagim that are not connected to mitzvos, or not connected to transgressions. They're just nice things that we do. In particular, when it comes to communal customs, many of them have to do with avoiding transgression, right? We put many barriers, guvulot, right? Many fences in place to avoid it. So exactly to your point, that is why this pasuk itself, this verse, might be referring to communal minhagim, which most often are minhagim that are put into place, not always, but often put into place to avoid further transgression. So yes, a point very well taken. And the third pasuk is a pasuk in Devarim, that al pi Torah asher yorucha, in source 3, that according to the law that they teach you, v'al mishpa asher yomru lecha, and according to the judgment and the laws that they tell you, that tasa and leisasor mina davar asher yagidu lecha yaminu small, that anything that the rabbis instruct you or tell you, so you shouldn't divert right or left. And of course, this is the famed pasuk. This is the verse that's brought down to give weight to the rabbis' words, to Chazal when they put certain decrees or certain laws into action. But it's also brought down to teach us that anything that they say, even if it's a minhag, even if it's just a custom and it's not an actual halacha, it's not an actual law that was set in place. The Rambam in Hilchos Mamre brings this down. The Rambam says everything's included in this when it comes to laws, when it comes to instructions, even when it comes to customs. So customs carry a lot of weight. Customs are not just something that are cute. They're not just something like me pouring the wine into my cousin's hands. They're a real, they have a binding effect on a community, on a family, and on an individual. And we see that, again, 3 times in the 3 different psukim. The first one in source 1, most primarily referring to the family minhagim, the family customs. Source 2, the communal customs. And source 3, both on the individual level of we each have to follow the customs that the rabbis, that the previous generations put in place, and also on a national level. So that's really where we see the 3 different sources, the 3 different places that minhagim gain their power and authority from, and that they're not nothing, they're something that have to be contended with, and something that often, not often, but can sometimes even, I don't want to say contradicts halacha, but certainly supports halacha and has to be contended with when a halacha and a minhag come to head. So that's just the basic background to realize that what we're about to learn has a lot of weight, and it's not just something cute and that adds meaning to our everyday practices in life. So, how's a minhag created, right? Meaning, how do I start a minhag? So, okay, there's minhagim that I have from my parents. There's minhagim that I have from my community. But one day I wake up and I think, all right, there's some nice things that I'd like to enact in my family or my private life. How do I start a minhag? How does it become binding? So in source 4, the Gemara in Shavuos tells us, Amar Shmuel, Gamar belibo tzarich shiyotzi b'svasav shenamar levate b'svasayim. That even, Shmuel says, that even if a person decides that he wants to take an oath, in his heart, he decides, I want to swear to do X, Y, or Z. You have to express it in words. There has to be a verbal communication, a verbal expression for a shvua, for an oath, or a neder, or a vow to take place. And what that means is if a person comes along and he says, well, or he thinks, I really don't plan on eating meat anymore, or I plan on taking upon myself the following nice practice. If he doesn't actually verbally express that, there's nothing to it, because it has to be, and this is brought down in a few places, that your heart and your mouth are equal. It has to be that there's a clear expression of what you want to do, and only when there's that clear expression that's verbally expressed does it become binding on the Torah level. And again, vows and oaths are binding on the Torah level. That a person lo yachel devaro, that they can't transgress what they say. It means that our words have weight and power. And when a person expresses what they want to do, what they plan on not doing, so that becomes binding, and there's a Torah obligation to keep to it. So much so that if a person transgresses it, so he has to bring a korban, he has to bring a sacrifice. It's binding, right? So now how does that work with minhagim? Because not always do we actually express what we're saying, right? Many a times we just act, we do. We come across that we do something 3 times, 2 times, 1 time, whatever it is. At what point does it become binding? Right? I always grew up and I was told, well, if you do something 3 times, done. That's it. You always have to do it. That was a very scary thing if you think about it. There's a lot of things I do 3 times. What, I'm stuck doing it forever? How does that work? Right? Magic, right? 3 times, 3 is the magic number. There's a lot of magic numbers in Judaism. 3, 7, 42. By the way, 42 is not made up. We don't have time to get into why 42 is a magic number, but 42 is a magic number. Hamevin Yavin. Okay, so again, you have to express it. You have to do it. So the Rambam in source 5 says this explicitly. He says, "V'eina noder nasa b'davar she'asar al atzmo," that a person is not forbidden in that which he tried to forbid or forbade upon himself. Ad sheyotzi b'svasav v'yapiv v'libo shaven. It has to be that his heart and his words are equal. They're the same, and that's what we said when it comes to oaths. That the only way to create something binding upon yourself, and this is obviously a very a powerful lesson from the Torah to teach us how binding our words can be. But on a halachic level, it needs to be that there's a verbal expression. Okay, so that works when I say I'm going to do something or I'm not going to do something. That's fantastic. Then it becomes binding on a Torah level. But as we said before, we don't always express it in words, and sometimes we just do. So how does that work? So the Gemara in source 6, and after the next 2 sources, we'll take a pause, or if anyone has any questions. The Gemara in source 6 tells us in the Darim, could there be a rabbinic expression of bal yachel? Meaning when someone says something and expresses that they're not going to do something, or they take a vow, or they take an oath, usually as at least if it's expressed verbally, so it becomes binding on them. Is there on a Torah level? Is it ever binding on them on a rabbinic level, a lower level, so to say? So yes, it could be. V'atanya, as we've taught in the Brisa, Devarim hamutarim v'achirim na'agu b'hem eser. If you have something that's technically permitted from the Torah, something that is totally permissible for a person to partake in, to involve himself in, and others or a person decides that he's going to treat it as forbidden to himself, you're not permitted to annul that anymore. That if a person decides, I'm not going to eat steak, or I'm going to do the following action, if a person thinks that and does that, then that becomes binding on a rabbinic level. Now, that's, if you think about, a little problematic, because we learned that there needs to be a verbal expression. It needs to be that which is in your mind and your heart is then verbally expressed in order to become binding on you. And that's whether with what you're thinking, that's whether it's a vow or an oath, or what we're talking about, a custom that you're going to now do. And yet the Gemara in Nedarim, in source 6, tells us that if a person just thinks that, well, this is permitted technically, I am going to treat it as something that's forbidden to me, so that becomes binding. So how does that fit? I thought we need to verbally express it. And yet in source 6, it would seem to come out, I don't need to verbally express anything. If I just treat it as forbidden, from now on, this is forbidden to me. Steak? Nope, I don't eat it anymore. It's forbidden. It's stuck. So how do we deal with those two sources together, right? So that's a contradiction. So what do we do with that? Now, you could just tell me, well, that's not a fair question because you skipped the first 3 words of the source that says, meaning on a Torah level, on a Deoraisa level, you need to have a verbal expression. But on a rabbinic level, who said you need an expression? Maybe on a rabbinic level, it's enough just to follow through with your actions, even if you never verbally expressed it. It's true. That definitely is true, that it would be binding on a rabbinic level, but why should that be so? Meaning if the whole idea is that when we say something, it becomes binding, and it's so important how we say it and what we say, then why should it be that if I don't say anything, it should be binding on any level? Who's to say I really meant it? Usually if a person means something, they verbalize it. If you really want to stick to something, write it down, verbalize it, say something. So even on a rabbinic level, why should that become binding? So the way to say it is usually we say actions speak louder than words, but really actions speak just as loud as words. And that is in source 7, the Maharam Shik, Rav Moshe Shik, he lived during the 1800s, he was from Hungary. So he suggested that why should it be that a minhag, a custom, an action that we do should be binding like a vow a person takes? It would seem to imply that even if I do an action, even if I take upon myself a certain custom and I never express it in my life, somehow it becomes binding like a vow or an oath that I need to express. How does that work? So he says, we have to say, because you're doing so, because you're doing an action, when a person goes through with the actions that they intended, even without a verbal expression, it becomes binding because that shows that you meant it. If I think in my heart, I want to do the following custom. I want to, we'll take it for example, I want to stand during Lichadodi every single Friday night. And I never express it, I never say anything. But then every single Friday night for the next few months, or for the next few weeks, I stand up. So that shows that I meant what I said in my heart. That shows that I meant what I was thinking. And because of that, it becomes binding. Right? Ultimately, you need to mean something. And whether that's through a verbal expression, whether that's through the physical action, so then either way it can become binding. Now, it won't become binding on a biblical, on a Torah level if I don't express it, but it becomes binding nonetheless on a rabbinic level, and that's something very important. And that's where a minhag, that's where a custom gains its strength from. A custom is akin to a vow or an oath that a person takes and undertakes upon himself. So when I have a custom, if I take it upon myself to do it, and we'll find exactly the exact parameters and details in the next few minutes, but if I take it upon myself and mean it in my heart, even without verbal expression, and certainly all the more so with a verbal expression, that becomes binding in the way that it's like a vow or an oath, and it would need to be annulled, right? If I mean something and I keep doing it, so the only way out, the only way to stop, and we'll see which ones this is true for, is to get it annulled. So if a person decided, I'm always going to be standing for let's say the Amida or Yom Kippur, I'm always standing, and they decided that, and they do, and they stand year in and year out, and then one year they're tired, they don't want to, whatever it is, so then perhaps that person would actually need to annul that vow, because while he didn't verbally express it, he did it year in and year out, and it showed that he meant it and was part of his practice. And that's something that might need to have a hataras nadarim, something that's annulled in order for him to go forward without standing, right? So that's where this gets its strength and veracity from. Okay, so we'll see now, what does it mean that it can be annulled or not? See, normally when I have a vow, when I have a vow or an oath, so it's questionable whether I should be able to annul it. And there's specifically when it comes to when I do an action, when I have a minhag, when I have a custom, should I be allowed to annul that? Maybe when I have a custom that I undertook upon myself, I'm treating it as real. And who's to say I'm allowed to get rid of that? I treated it as this is real, like the Torah is telling me I need to be doing something. It means something now. Who's to say I'm allowed to annul it? Also, where'd 3 times come from? 3 times we're going to see is a number. It wasn't just made up. When I think of 3 times, there was a guy who called up his lawyer. I think his lawyer was Mr. Thomas, let's say. So he called up his lawyer, to get some information, whatever it was, about an upcoming court case. Maybe it had to do with a traffic ticket, a speeding ticket. So he called up his lawyer, and the lawyer's secretary in the office answered. They said, "Can I please speak to Mr. Thomas?" And the lawyer said, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but Mr. Thomas unfortunately passed away today." So the man said, okay. So he hung up. The next day, the same man calls the secretary and he says, "Excuse me, can I please speak to Mr. Thomas?" And the secretary says, "I'm sorry, sir, but as I said, he passed away. I'm sorry." Okay, and he hangs up. For a 3rd day in the row, 3 times, he calls up and he says, "Can I please speak to Mr. Thomas?" And the secretary says, "Excuse me, sir. Oh, did you forget? He passed away. I'm sorry. Well, why do you keep calling?" And the guy said, "Oh, no, I just never, I like hearing it." Okay, so 3 times. If anyone's a lawyer here, forgive me, I'm sorry. We like lawyers, they're good. So 3 times, is it a magical number? What is it? So that's something we're going to see very shortly. Okay, so in source 8, let's talk now. We talked about essentially what the binding or the veracity, the force behind a minhag or a custom or a vow is. But what happens if I want to annul it? So the Rosh in source 8, see, he says, "V'chein nami," and this is page 2. I apologize, we don't actually have page numbers here. But he says, "V'chein nami adam shenahag iser b'davar hamutar l'siag l'prishas l'yatir le'hachacham haminhagahu." That if a person takes upon himself a minhag, a custom, either as a boundary to avoid something that he shouldn't come to, or as a boundary to avoid a transgression in the Torah, so no one should just come along and annul it so simply for him. If someone took it on and he means it, it shouldn't be something that he annuls so quickly. Dehave kamo neder. Why? Because it's treated like a vow or an oath. And a vow or an oath is something with real capabilities, real power, and it's not so simple that you just get rid of it when a person said they're going to do something. K'de'isa b'perek beis nedarim, because we teach in that Gemara Nedarim that we just saw, Tanya, devarim hamutarim v'achirim nahagu bo iser, I ata rashai lahatiran, that if there's something that's technically permissible and someone takes upon himself to treat it as it's forbidden, you're not allowed to permit it to him anymore. That becomes binding upon him. Mishum shenamar lo yachel devaro, because we're told he shouldn't transgress his words. His words have power. His words have koach. They mean something. He can't transgress that now. So what are you supposed to do? All of a sudden, I have a custom, I have a minhag, I have a vow, I have an oath. What am I supposed to do about that? I'm stuck. So says the Rush, Aval hachacham yachol lahatir lahem becharata. You know what the rabbi is able to do? The chacham and really 3 others together, are able to annul it if he regrets it. And the person can come along and say, I regret having taken this custom upon myself without saying bli neder, without having treated it as a non-vow, right? A person shouldn't regret the good things that they did. Maybe they did good things by keeping this custom, but they have to say they regret taking it upon themselves like a vow. And if they're able to do that, if they're able to express that, so says the Rush, they're able to annul the custom, they're able to annul the practice that they've kept until now. So that's one opinion. One opinion basically is you have a way out. You're stuck. You took upon yourself a custom that you don't want to keep. Maybe it's your father's custom, certainly not a communal custom. Maybe in Mirz Hashem, we'll see at the end that a communal custom is not so simple to divorce yourself from. Certainly if you were part and parcel of a community very entrenched in it. But certainly on individual and family level, if a person needs to get rid of this minhag, it's not working for them for whatever the reasons are, so you can annul it and you're out. So that's the opinion of the Rush. But he's not the only opinion, because in source 9, the Rashba tells us something differently. And the Rashba tells us, V'chol mi shenoeg iser b'davar hamuter legeder, efsher shehu chamor mina neder v'hashvua. It's very possible, says the Rashba, that if someone takes a custom upon themselves and something that was permitted, they decide to forbid upon themselves, or they say, I'm going to do the following action even though I don't need to. So he says it's very stronger that actions are stronger than words. When it comes to a vow, when it comes to an oath, those can be annulled. But an action that a person took upon themselves, something that they've taken upon themselves to do or to not do, so maybe, says the Rashba, that takes on the power of the Torah. That the Torah tells you you're allowed to do X, Y, and Z, and you said, I'm not going to do X, Y, and Z. And by doing so, you're basically saying, I'm treating that on the level of the Torah. That there are many things that the Torah tells me I'm not allowed to do, and I'm adding something else that I'm not going to do. Obviously, it's not adding to the Torah. A person realizes it's not Hashem didn't tell him to do that. But on the level of the mind and on the level of the commitment to this, a person's basically saying, this is real to me, and maybe actions are stronger than words. And because of that, the Rashba says, and continuing in the source 9, he says, if a person takes upon themselves this custom, and they have this action that they're doing, they're not allowed to annul it. They're stuck, says the Rashba. Now, that's not that doesn't bode so well for any of us who have customs that at some point we might not be able to keep, or we don't want to keep, or people are stuck in certain circumstances. So that would be very difficult, because ultimately the Rashba is coming out, and again, a very powerful. All this can be explained on a very hashkafic or psychological level. But just on a basic halachic or practical level, this becomes very impractical, so to say, because it comes along the Rashba and says, you're stuck. You should have realized that your actions carry weight, that your words certainly carry weight, and all the more so your actions. So, according to the Rashba, a person would be stuck and wouldn't be able to change anything. Okay, so that's the background. So now what do we do with that? Who do we hold like, right? I won't take a vote what everyone hopes we hold like, but I know who I'm rooting for. Now it happens to be I saw the Shulchan Aruch, so I know how it comes out. But if anyone's on the edge of their seats, we have to figure out which one and who do we hold like here. So the Shulchan Aruch, and this source is a very important source, because he's going to now lay out a bunch of the rules and really what follows in much of our practice when it comes to customs. So he says in source 10, Devarim hamutarim v'hayodim behem shehem mutarim, that there are many things that are permitted, and someone who realizes that they're permitted. So let's take example steak. I don't know why we go to steak, but steak will be our example. So someone knows steak is permitted. He knows the Torah did not forbid steak. It is kosher steak. I am allowed to eat the steak. And nonetheless, nagu bahem iser. A person decides, no, steak is not for me. Why? Because I'm trying to stay away from achilas gas. I'm trying to stay away from all my wants and all my desires. I'm trying to limit myself, and so that's why I'll stay away from steak. When he does so, ki'ilu kiblu alehem beneder. When a person decides that, so it's like he takes it upon himself like a vow to not eat steak. V'asur lahatiram behem, and you're not allowed to just simply permit him to eat steak willy-nilly, right? If he said it, he means it. If sure he said it, that they're stuck, so to say. You can't just get rid of it so easily. Hilkach. So So therefore, if someone is accustomed to fasting before Rosh Hashanah, Ushabein Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippurim, and he also has the custom to fast in between certain days in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Or a person who has the custom to not eat from the first day of Av until Yud Zayin of Tammuz, or from Yud Zayin of Tammuz. If a person has a custom not to eat meat even past the 9 days, Verotza lachzor. Sorry, when I say past, I mean before. Verotza lachzor bo machma she'enu bari. Sorry, gimel shiatirulo. Therefore, if a person took upon himself any of these customs that do have a basis, and he meant it, so you can't just get rid of it so easily. You have to go before 3, and they annul it for you. And again, the practice would be that a person says, I regret having taken this upon myself like a vow. And then the Shulchan Aruch says, Im b'shah shehiskal linhog, hayadaito linhog kain le'olam. Now here are the following rules. Again, it's treated like a vow. Now, when is it treated like a vow? And here's the first rule. If when a person took upon themselves this custom, he had in mind to accustom himself to do this forever, the nahag kain afilu pamachas, even once he only does it one time, sarich hatara v'yifta becharata shemiskarit shnag kain l'shem neder. It is stuck, and the only way to get out of it is if he regrets it and goes to the 3 to annul it. But what that means is the first rule would be that if a person had in mind, whatever I'm about to do, I don't see why I won't be doing this forever. I feel such a strong conviction towards what I'm deciding that I plan on doing it forever. And he does it the first time, it is binding. Not 3 times, 1 time with intent to continue. So that's the first one. Lefikach harotza linhog b'ksas devarim hamutarim l'siag uprecious yomer betchilas hanhagaso she'enu makabel love came beneder. That therefore, if a person ever has in mind to do something to stay away from bad things or to do good things, he has a custom he wants to take upon himself. So what should he say? Li neder. I'm taking this upon myself without the power of a vow. And therefore, even if I have intention, hopefully I'll continue this for the rest of my life. Hopefully I'll do this day in and day out. Hopefully I'll do this weekly, every Shabbos, whatever it is. If I said bli neder, so I mean to do it, but I don't mean that it takes on the power of a vow that is much more difficult to annul and certainly has a certain power behind it. And he finishes here, V'gam yomer shein b'daito linho kain el b'pama hu b'pamayim she'yirtza v'leila olam. And what's more, he should say, I don't know if I'm continuing this forever. I'll try it once or twice. That's essentially what a person should say. To avoid this issue, to avoid being stuck and making something forbidden on you forever or something that you always have to do forever, a person should express, bli neder, I mean to do this, but not with the power of a vow. And I'll do it once, I'll do it twice, and it'll go on. But as long as you said bli neder without intention that this should be on the level of a vow, so a person is good to go. And that's why a lot of the minhagim that a person starts, a lot of customs that a person starts, so it's very important for us to say bli neder, meaning I mean what I'm doing with a certain level of conviction, and I mean to be doing it, and I think it will be very impactful on my life. But I also recognize the power of words, and I recognize I don't want this to be binding on a rabbinic or Torah level. So that is what the Shulchan Aruch would suggest. Now, what about 3 times and more? So while it's not explicit in the Shulchan Aruch right here, essentially it falls out like this: that if a person means, and these are the 3 permutations that you could have. So if I say bli neder, that I don't mean for this custom to become a vow, I'm good. It doesn't matter how many times I do it afterwards. That's one. The second level would be if I do it even 1 time with intention that I should always continue, that becomes binding, even 1 time. So where do 3 times come from? So 3 times, if I do a custom 3 times without intention that it should become binding or that I'm going to do it forever, but I didn't say bli neder, that I didn't say it should be without the level of a vow, so then it becomes binding after 3 times. See, 1 time with intention is binding. 3 times even without intention is binding. So why should that be? 3 times, why is it magic? So I think it's based on what we saw before in source, what is it, 6 or 7? In source 7, we saw the Maharam Shik, that Rabbi Shik said that actions are very strong. And when a person does an action, 3 times in a row, essentially. So it becomes binding to the degree that you've demonstrated you mean it. You've demonstrated that even you don't have a mind to do this forever. You've demonstrated that you mean to continue this after 3 times. And so that becomes binding unless you said, unless you said, I don't mean for this to become binding on a level of a vow. So that is practical halacha. That's how we come out. Now we're about to see, and I'll pause for a second, but we're about to see that there are certain exceptions to certain vows that do not become binding, even if I had intention, or even if, let's say, I did it 3 times without intention. So we're about to see a few exceptions. But I see there was one question in the chat, and if anyone has any further questions right now, we can ask. Interesting. So there's a question in the chat. I'll say that this seems more in particular an individual question as opposed to just a general question about Minhagim. So Mirza Hashem, maybe I can address that at the end. But any questions so far on what we've done? Any clarification? Okay, great. So I'll assume that's good. Either it means everyone's lost or it means everyone's following and we're good. So I'll go with the latter. I like that. It sounds nicer. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch is coming out like the Rush, that yes, by the way, even if it is binding, so you can annul it if there's need. It's not like the Rashba, who he cites later, that you can't annul it even if you wanted to. So that's good news for all of us, right? We're able to annul something if we need to, but again, to realize that things do become binding if I do it 1 time with intention to continue, or if I do it 3 times even without intention to continue. And therefore, I should make sure that when I express myself, or even if I don't express it, I just do it. So I should make sure to say bli neder, that this is not binding like a vow. So we already saw, in source 11 and 12 really speak out about doing something 3 times. And we explained that because when I do it 3 times, actions are just as strong as words. So let's talk about a few exceptions, right? Does that mean every action I do 3 times without intention to continue, so that becomes a minhag? Now, I want to share a secret here. Not every minhag that we do is truly a minhag. So what do I mean by that? So in the middle of source 10, the Shulchan Aruch talks about a mistake. Let's say I keep a minhag. Let's say like this. Let's imagine I think it's a minhag to keep Shabbos. Well, let's go to an extreme. I think it's a minhag to keep Shabbos. I don't know anything. I've come into Judaism. I'm Baal Tshuva. I just don't know. It's a minhag to keep Shabbos, whatever a minhag is. And then all of a sudden one day I realize, oh, it's actually a halacha. I actually have to keep Shabbos. So that, it was never a minhag. That was just a halacha. So that was an extreme. So let's just talk about simple things. Just if there's a basic halacha out there that I thought was a minhag, and I thought I was keeping it because it's a minhag. So one day when I decide that I don't want to do it or the like, so that was never a minhag because that was just a halacha. On the opposite end, if I thought this was a binding halacha, and it's not, if I thought it was a halacha that, for example, a man is not allowed to wear a watch. Let's say I thought that was a halacha. So, and a few years later, I want to annul that vow because I decided my wife got me a very nice watch. I want to start wearing a watch. Do I have to annul that? I had a minhag for years not to wear a watch because I thought it was a binding halacha that the rabbi stated that I'm not allowed to. Well, my wife got me a really nice watch. I'm done with this minhag. You don't need to annul it because it was you thought it was a halacha. So anytime someone has a mistaken thought, they think something is a halacha, or they think it's not, whatever it is, that they're keeping the minhag based on that. So that's not a minhag. That's something based on a mistake. And that doesn't need annulment. Another example would be someone who thinks that you need to, let's say, eat matzah shmura all of Pesach. If a person thinks he needs to eat shmura matzah all of Pesach, guarded from the time it was reaped or from the time it was planted, if a person thought that was a halacha and he was doing it for years, and then he decides, I'm done keeping shmura matzah for all of Pesach, I'll just do it the first days, you don't need to annul that because that was a minhag based on a mistake, right? So that's one exception. The other exception is in source 13, and I think probably this one is much more closer to home and applies to many more of us, that the pre-Chadash, Rav Chizkiah De Silvia, he says that there are two types of minhagim. There's minhagim that we do, and we talked about this to start, that we do and we take upon ourselves to avoid transgressing, to avoid doing something. And there's minhagim in that similar camp that we do that have to do with a mitzvah, that relate to a mitzvah. And I would add, there are certain minhagim that a person might do because whether or not we are fully aware, they're based on Kabbalistic ideas. So all of those are minhagim that stem from Torah. They stem from something. So that's one camp. But then there's another type of minhag, what the Pri Chadash calls over here in source 13 on the third line at the bottom, milta yisirta, just extra things, nice ideas. He says that if someone kept that type of minhag, it was a nice idea, but it has nothing to do with the halacha, it has nothing to do with staying away from a transgression, it has nothing to do with Kabbalistic ideas. So it's a nice thing that you were doing, and perhaps it inspired you, and perhaps it helped each and every single one of us, inspire ourselves and grow. But that's not a minhag. A minhag is based and has some basis in Torah. It has some basis to keep us away from something that's forbidden. It has some basis to some mitzvah connected to something or on a Kabbalistic level. But just something nice is not a minhag that would need to be annulled. That's a minhag that a person could stop doing. So let's take, for example, not something silly. Kabbalah Shabbos, Friday nights. Mitzvah Hashem, next week we'll talk a lot about lechadodi. There are some beautiful customs when it comes to lechadodi. And if a person has a custom to stand up for lechadodi, and all of a sudden, years later, they don't want to stand up anymore, so they would likely have to annul that because that's a minhag based on Kabbalistic ideas. But let's say a person took upon themselves to always stand for Yidid Nefesh. For whatever reason, they thought Yidid Nefesh was beautiful. They thought it was a beautiful thing to stand there as the Shekhinah on Shabbos comes in and Hashem is coming in beautiful, true ideas. But, and one could correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's a Kabbalistic source to stand for Yidid Nefesh. And so there's no source. It's not related to a mitzvah. It's not related to stopping someone or keeping someone away from a transgression. And nor is it based on a Kabbalistic source. And because of that, you wouldn't need to annul it if at some point you decided, okay, it's not for me anymore, right? A minhag has to be based, it has to be sourced, it has to be connected to something real in order to count as a minhag that has power and needs to be something that would be annulled. But if it's not connected that way, so it's a nice idea, but it's not a minhag that has force, that has power, that would need to be annulled. So that would be another exception to something that doesn't need to be annulled. The last exception, and I don't have it in our source sheet, but another exception to this would be, what if someone took upon themselves, and this is brought down in the Ramah when it comes to fasting, what would happen if a person had a custom to fast every single year Bahab? Bahab are the Monday, Thursday, Monday fast days following the Yom Tovim, following the holidays that many people have the custom to fast for those days. The idea is maybe we were involved in some frivolity. Maybe we said things we shouldn't have in our joy of the holiday. But whatever the reason is, many people have the custom to fast. So let's say for years and years a person fasts, and then one year all of a sudden they're not strong enough to fast. They're just not strong enough. Their health is weakened, or let's say there's a bris milah, and all of a sudden the bris milah comes out on that day and they want to partake in the meal. So what are you supposed to do? So it's brought down, and the Shach, I believe, talks about this. He says that if a bris milah comes up, so you're allowed to eat on that day, even though you've had the custom for years and years and years to fast. If a bris milah happens on that day, you would be allowed to eat. Why? Because when you first took upon this custom, you imagine there would probably be a day that you wouldn't be able to fast, because maybe there would be a simcha, maybe there would be a wedding, maybe there would be a bris milah, and because of that, it was built into your original thought process. So many minhagim that we have are built into the thought process, built into the very custom is the reasonable idea that there might be a time that it doesn't make sense for one particular day, or it might make a time where it's very difficult for some particular reason, and it's built into the minhag. And so a person doesn't have to annul it to eat that day. But if a person becomes ill and is no longer able to fast. And he had this minhag for fasting for years and years and years. So when he took upon this minhag, he never envisioned that he would just have to stop keeping it, that he would become sick to a point that he wouldn't be able to fast anymore. So that wouldn't be built into the minhag. So I just say that difference just to be able to highlight that sometimes we have a minhag that doesn't need to be annulled because it's built into the very nature of how I accepted this, even without having said bli neder, even though it was a full out minhag, a custom that was binding like a vow on certainly on a rabbinic level, sometimes built into the actual framework. I don't need to annul it because that was reasonable at the time that I took it upon myself. So that's just when it comes to Yom Kippur, for example. So if a person has a minhag to stand all of Yom Kippur during the Amidah, so that's based on certainly on mitzvos. It's based on definitely Kabbalistic ideas. But if a person decides, therefore, that he wants to stop standing on Yom Kippur, so he would probably have to annul that vow. But what if a person just was weak and from now on they're not able to stand? So likely that's not something that they had in mind. You had in mind that you'll be doing this forever. So that too would have to be it too would have to be annulled, right? Because that was a practice that's based on a mitzvah, based on something good, not just something random. That again was not factored in. I didn't think years later I'm not going to be able to do this. Okay, so those are just a few exceptions. Yes.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this one that you brought up about matzah shmura, meaning not about being handmade, but about being shmura mishas ksira.
Yeah.
And that indeed, and in fact, the Pri Chadash, you didn't read through that line there, but the Pri Chadash brings that same example. So, and yet it sounds like from what you're saying, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that while that particular one where it's just this extra thing, but it's not really the mitzvah and it's not really, anything usher, and therefore that would not need hatara, but that if somebody keeps either that they only eat 18-minute matzah, 18-minute machine matzah, etc., for the whole Pesach, or somebody who, because of the concern that maybe the machine wasn't cleaned, etc., or somebody who keeps gebrachs, rather not eating gebrachs for the first 7 days of Pesach, again, out of concern that there might have been something that might be usher, etc., that those would need hatara where the shmura wouldn't.
Yes, except I will say, if a person kept gebrachs because they thought it's halacha, it's 100% halacha, so that would be a custom based on a mistake. It's not halacha, it's a minhag.
Right. But if they understand the meaning of why it is that gebrachs has come about as a thing, and they keep it as that extra stringency, then they would need a hatar on that, where they wouldn't need on the
yes, it would need to be annulled. It would need a hatar sandarim. Yes.
Can I go back to the Lichad Dodi thing for a second? So this actually goes to a lot of Minhagim with shuls, and I know Rabbi Rosenbaum was going to talk about Minhagim with our shul in the third episode, but if let's say you grew up in the shul, I know there's a shul in Atlanta. I've been there. There's a shul in Atlanta where they stay. Their minhag makom is to stand for all Lichad Dodi.
Okay.
So if you grew up in the shul, now we don't really have minhag makom the way they had like in Europe.
Right.
People come from everywhere, and the minhag makom doesn't really. But so if you came from a shul, like say from that shul, you grew up there, and now you're 18 years old and you go off to yeshiva, to college, or whatever, and all of a sudden you find out there are places where they're not standing. Is that now a binding minhag on you? Would you need hatara, or was it really binding on you just because you grew up there?
It's a very good question, and this gets down to the crux of how do we treat communal minhagim vis-a-vis the individual, right? When and how does that become binding versus a family minhag? So you know what? Let's hold off on answering that. Let's see the next two sources. Wow, there's a lot to fit in. Okay, so let's at least we'll get through the next two sources to be able to answer your question. How do we treat a communal custom vis-a-vis the individual, and how does that compare to a family custom? But it's a very good question. So in source 14, there's a story that the Gemara brings down, which a lot of the laws of customs are based on this. And the story goes as follows. In source 14 on the third page, B'nei Beishan Nahug Delei Havu Azlin Mitzor Litzidon B'mali Shabasa. That the residents, the people of Beishan, they had the minhag not to travel from Sur to Tzidon on Erev Shabbos. On Friday afternoon, they wouldn't travel for business. Asu B'naihu Kamei Rabbi Yochanan. So the descendants, the children of these people who had this custom, in Beishan came to Rabbi Yochanan and Amr lo, and they said to him, Avosin, Efshar lahu. Our fathers were able to do it. They were rich, they were wealthy, they didn't have to work on Fridays. Anan lo efsharlan. It's not possible. We're not as wealthy. We're not as well off. We need to work on Fridays. Can we abolish the minhag? Are we allowed to work? And Amr lahu, Rabbi Yochanan turned to them and he said, Kavar kiblu avosechem alehem shneamar shema b'ni musar avicha ve'altitos torasimecha. No, I'm sorry. Your father's minhag, the custom remains in effect. The communal custom that this place has remains in effect on you, the descendants, and you're not allowed to work on Friday because that minhag became binding. It was a minhag to protect Shabbos, to protect a person from working, going into Shabbos, and it becomes binding. So that would be an example of a communal setting becoming binding on the people still living there, on the descendants. Now, the problem is that goes to head with the next source, source 15, which seemingly contradicts it. Because Mar Ukva says in source 15, with regards to my father, I'm like vinegar, the son of wine, meaning my father was much greater than I am. Di'ilu Abba, because my father, kihu achel bisra ha'idna lehava achel givina alamachar hashta, that my father, after eating meat, would wait 24 hours before eating dairy. Vi'ilu Ana, but me, I'm not as great. And bahastu udasa hu le'achilna l'sudasa achrina achilna. I won't eat dairy after meat at the same meal, but at the next meal I'll eat it. So from this Gemara, it would seem like Mar Ukva is admitting, my father was much greater than me. My father was much greater, and he had the custom to wait 24 hours between meat and dairy. And me, I don't do that. I'm not as great as my father. And what seemingly comes out from that Gemara, all the poskim, all the commentaries say, is that you don't have to follow the custom of your father. His father waited 24 hours, or Mar Ukva didn't have to wait 24 hours. It must teach us you don't have to follow the custom of your father. It's not binding. And yet in source 14, Rabbi Yochanan turns to the residents of Beishan and he says, your father's minhag, your father's custom is binding. So which one is it? One of the sources has to give, right? Or we have to understand what the sources are telling us. Are our families, the past generations' customs binding on us or not? Right? So the Pri Chadash, and we definitely don't have time to read this source inside, unfortunately. But the Pri Chadash in source 16 essentially tells us that there's a difference. That it's clear from these sources that in source 15, a father's and family's customs do not necessarily become binding on their children because it's what the father's doing and it hits custom. And obviously, while they're in the family, that's their custom. But if the child after bar mitzvah never did this himself, or he only did it to honor his father, but he never really meant to take it on himself, so it doesn't become binding. Now, practically in most cases, once a kid is bar mitzvah, very often they end up doing the custom of the father and they just do it 3 times without any other intentions. And the mela, it just becomes binding. But just on the halachic level, realize it doesn't need to happen that way. And it's not technically binding. It just usually becomes binding because that's how it ends up happening. But it doesn't have to be that way. Versus a communal custom, just like, and the Ramban talks about this when it comes to Kabbalah Satorah, when we accepted the Torah. Our ancestors accepted the Torah and they accepted everything upon themselves. And we see a prototype, we see an example of a previous generation accepting everything and then it trickling down to all future generations. And when it comes to a minhag, if there's a community and a community takes upon themselves a certain minhag, a certain practice, it becomes binding for all the future residents and descendants of that community. And again, that community could have annulled it if they wanted. But as a group of descendants and the people living in that place, it becomes binding. And that's essentially how the Pri Chadash answers. He says they're not contradictions. Source 15 about Mar Ukva not being as great as his father. He didn't follow his father's custom because when he became bar mitzvah, he didn't take it on and he didn't do it 3 times and it wasn't binding upon him. But in source 14, we're talking about an entire generation of people who were doing it. And even if they hadn't wanted to, it became binding on a communal level. And that would ultimately account for the difference between the two. So, Seth, to answer your question, what do you do about a communal minhag? So it's, in a certain sense, it's tragic and it's sad because nowadays the minhag makom, the custom of the place, it becomes limited. It used to be when you had communities that were the epicenter, they were very together. There was a certain actus of a community. And what they took upon themselves was binding together as an entire community on every single individual. But unfortunately, the way, certainly once we came to America and Europe, the way, the destruction of Europe really ended up in a way of everyone doing their own thing, many people coming from different communities in Europe, and they all came together and built communities in America of many people with different customs and different things. And so the whole idea of one community with one idea, with one identity, and therefore one custom, one binding custom on a whole, became very limited. Now, when it comes to a shul, and a shul has a certain minhag, so let's say, for example, like Seth was talking about, standing up in shul. Right? Everyone stands up for L'Chadodi in the shul, and you were doing it for years and years and years. So on a communal level, if that was it, and you go elsewhere, so seemingly that shouldn't be binding on you, right? Because the community is binding so long as you are there. But when you go to a new community, technically a new community's minhagim and customs should become binding on you. Now, we don't really have such a concept. On a more practical level, I would answer you, Seth, and that is that often if a person is 18, so what it means is for years and years and years, they've been doing this custom in the community. They didn't take it upon themselves because the community, because of the communal custom, just by nature of doing it 3 times, once they were bar mitzvahed, even without intent to continue or not, this was a custom they've now accustomed themselves to. So practically, often it does become the person's custom on the individual level. Does that make sense? So that's essentially the family versus communal. Now, we don't really have time to talk about communal versus family so much longer, but just to realize that the family minhagim are, again, on a practical level, often binding because a person's been accustomed himself to them after 3 times. A son, a daughter, whatever it is, they've been doing this, or even they had intention to continue their parents' minhagim, and so they really do become binding. Just before we round out, so again, as a chazara, as a recap, and then we'll end off with I saw a very beautiful source. Again, we see that actions speak just as loud as words, that when we do an action, even without an expression that we're going to be doing a custom, so it becomes binding, certainly on a rabbinic level, as a vow. And that's something that therefore needs to be annulled. If we do it either 1 time with intent to continue, or 3 times even without the intent, but 3 times shows that it means something, it's compelling, it's something I plan on doing, so then it becomes binding. And if it's connected to a mitzvah, whether a positive mitzvah or keeping me away from other things I should stay away from, or it has Kabbalistic sources, so then that's very compelling. It becomes a binding custom for me as an individual, and something I have to keep to. And if at any point I want to annul it, I want to stop it, so it needs a taras nedarim. It needs me to go before 3 and annul it and say, I regret having taken this upon myself without having said bli neder. Right? I don't chas v'shalom, when we say this on Erev Rosh Hashanah, I don't chas v'shalom regret having done the good things I did or stayed away from the bad things I stayed away from. I regret having taken this upon myself like a vow. So that's how it would come out. And again, it's permissible to annul, and to realize that communal customs are certainly more complicated. Maybe we'll have time to touch on this next week when we talk about particular customs out there. And I'm sure Rabbi Rosenbaum in the last year will touch upon this. And to realize family customs are also very powerful. It's something that continues the family minhagim, continues on the legacy of a family and what's meaningful for them. But it doesn't necessarily need to be so. But often children go in the ways of their parents after the bar mitzvah anyway, and it's something that they want to take upon themselves, and something that memela that they did take upon themselves. And so often those minhagim too become binding in a real way. Just to end off, I saw something very beautiful by Rav Yerucham Lubavitz, that he says in source 17, Lubavitz, I'm sorry. He says in source 17, the whole nature that a person can take a vow and to treat something that was technically permitted as now forbidden, or the whole idea that a person can have a custom that was never from the Torah, and yet he brought it into his life, teaches us something tremendous. And that is, that person, he doesn't add to the Torah, but he has the power to bring more Torah, more of these aspects into his life. And what that means, and he says over here, that if a person is able to create, so to say, new aspects of Torah in his life, he's able to create new aspects of these customs and these vows and these laws that he keeps to. So what it means is it becomes part and parcel of the person. Because only if you're connected to the Torah, only if you're connected to Hashem, could you have that power to also create something that becomes binding on you. You know, we think opposites attract, but really similar things attract. And that is that we're all imbued with a connection to Torah. We're all imbued with that connection from birth. And while we might have forgotten it, but it's still in us. And that's where our ability to create something new for ourselves, whether it's something new as a custom of staying away from something or adding something positive to our life, that's where that stems from. Because he ends off in source 17, because where else would a person have the strength to be able to fulfill the Torah, to be able to fulfill these vows, to be able to fulfill all these things that he adds to his life, unless he was already connected to it? Because the strength that we gain, the strength that we have to be able to follow the Torah, to be able to add, so to say, these extra additional beautiful aspects of customs and vows to our lives, stems from that internal connection to the Torah. And I think that that's just something to realize. Again, the power that we have with words, the power that we have with our actions, both on an individual level, on a family level, on a communal level, is such a beautiful thing. And it stems from the deepest of places to our initial connection to Torah and our ability to therefore to be able to add, to find more meaning in it, in our lives, both in our words and our actions. So with that, you know, we'll conclude this this first part of the shir. If anyone has any questions to follow up on, again, the halakhic aspects of Minhagim, you know, we couldn't cover everything here. It is a vast, vast topic, but hopefully it gave you know, everyone an idea of where customs come from and the meaning behind them. And Ritz Hashem, next week we'll get into to exact customs. And when we see exact customs, we'll see where they came from, and we'll also maybe have an opportunity to discuss more aspects of the practical laws. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. And again, if anyone has any questions now, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello, Rabbi.
Yes.
Hi. Does that mean that because wearing bright colors to a funeral is not connected to a halacha specifically, that therefore it's just family practice and not relevant as far as?
So anyone here could feel free to chime in. I'm not aware of not wearing bright colors stemming from any Jewish sources. I could be incorrect because I haven't looked into it. So it could come from something, but assuming that it's not connected to anything, any Jewish source, whether a mitzvah, whether staying away from something and the like, so then right, it wouldn't be counted as a custom, so to say. Certainly not one that would need to be impressed upon others, and not one that would need to be annulled. Again, assuming that doesn't come from any Torah Jewish sources.
Okay. So,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, please. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.